He's a suspect. Now you're in quarantine. Report to the committee. No one is exempt. And the 17 Crusaders, they can't justify.
Censorship can be defined as the suppression or prohibition of ideas, speech, public communication, or other information that certain persons find objectionable. The humanities, as the discipline that includes visual art, literary art, performing arts, are often the target of censorship attempts. This video will first discuss attempts by several school districts across the United States to censor Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis from being taught in the classroom. Then we will delve into attempts to censor comics and graphic novels beginning in the late 1940s. Persepolis is far from the only graphic novel to face censorship challenges. With just a quick perusal of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund website, you can find it listed in good company, alongside the likes of Batman, The Sandman, Fun Home, Mouse, Watchmen, and even Dragon Ball. The website explains why some of these books face challenges. Comics are uniquely vulnerable to challenges because the medium thrives on the power of static images, and because there's a lingering stigma that comics are low-value speech. Some challenges are brought against comics because a single panel or a single page can be taken out of context, while others come under attack because of the mistaken notion that all comics are for children. Graphic novels are vulnerable to censorship because they rely on the reader to interpret the combination of text and image. Put another way, a reader of comics must actively contribute to the construction of meaning, as meaning does not lie in just the image or just the text. The two must be assimilated by the reader. This is the basis for Marshall McLuhan, a well-known Canadian media theorist in the 50s and 60s, categorizing comic books as a cool medium, a medium requiring more participation on the part of the viewer. Clearly ahead of his time, McLuhan foresaw a time when electronic media would dominate visual culture. Great Scott, how did he know? Turning specifically to Persepolis, public schools in Chicago were instructed by the district to remove the well-respected graphic novel from both libraries and classrooms in March 2013. Originally published in 2003, Persepolis had already been translated into 40 languages and won a half-dozen comic book and library awards before this even transpired. A letter from Chicago Public Schools contended that the book contained, quote, powerful images of torture, end quote, which were inappropriate for general use in the 7th grade curriculum. Let me be clear that this is not a case where just one 7th grade teacher used Persepolis in their classroom and was reprimanded for it. Rather, the text was an approved component of the Common Core Literacy Context Framework 7th grade curriculum prior to the complaint. If 7th grade teachers had not yet covered the graphic novel, then they were to remove all copies of the book from their classrooms. As you learned during our previous video, Persepolis deals with many political and social issues. Further, not all Americans are familiar with the history of Iran. The cited problem, however, was with the images. But how can it be that the images are such a problem when the artwork is rendered in a very intentional cartoonish style? The art is entirely black and white. In fact, there are not even any shades of gray. Good thing Marjane did not include 50 Shades of Grey, or someone might have taken issue with that. To quote Marjane herself, she settled on the cartoonish style because, quote, people don't take it so seriously, end quote. Her style also made sense with the inclusion of humor in her narrative to offset the tragic circumstances of her childhood. As with most cases of censorship, not everyone agreed. The district's head of libraries refused to comply, releasing her own statement saying that the book would remain on library shelves. Chicago Public Schools soon backtracked, now just insisting that the book was not appropriate for 7th graders, but was not a problem for older students. I'd like to use this example of censorship aimed at Persepolis to segue to the unfortunate history of censorship of comic books in general. From the early days of comics in the 1930s, they were often described as worthless or dangerous for literacy. By the late 1940s, there was a moral panic surrounding children reading comic books in the United States. It led to things such as seen in this image: students burning comic books in 1949. It got pretty bad. Frederick Wortham, a psychologist concerned that violence and sexuality in some comics was destroying values in children, published Seduction of the Innocent in 1954, eventually leading to this, the Comics Code in 1955. This censorship prohibited much of the previously existing comics content, in particular horror and crime comics. Artists turned to the safer genres of romance, war, and superhero material. This anti-comics campaign actually led to the creation of Mad Magazine. The cover of this October 1954 issue mocks the moralizing panic around comics. A fake newspaper headline celebrates the capture of comic book artists at their hideout, where they had stored a sizable amount of brushes. This week's Canvas course module will provide some additional information on Wortham and the Comics Code. Comics were, of course, fighting back and trying to increase the prestige of comic books. For example, the famous Comics Illustrated series sought to draw young readers into the world of classical literature. This popular comic book series was published between 1941 and 1971 and can definitely be read as an attempt to combat the concerns of the anti-comics camp. As many of you may be aware, since this time, censors have turned most of their attention to video games and later anime and manga. A video game rating system was implemented in 1994 by the Entertainment Software Association in response to criticism of controversial video games with excessively violent or sexual content, particularly after the 1993 congressional hearings following the releases of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap for home consoles and Doom for home computers.